Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Miss Karen Nielsen. Throughout her career, Miss Nielsen has held executive and board-level positions at ATCO EnPower, Generations Energy, ATCO Power, ARC Resources, Birchcliff Energy, and Crew Energy. Miss Nielsen also earned a bachelor's degree in engineering with distinction from the University of Saskatchewan and is a registered professional with APEGA. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This podcast episode is brought to you by EPAC, the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada. Good morning, Miss Karen Nielsen. Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate your time.
Oh, it's a privilege to be here. Good morning, Trevor.
For the listener, you have a long range of technical experience, but your most recent role as of late was Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at ATCO EnPower, I think it is?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I thought for the purposes today, we could structure the conversation on some of your early days in the energy industry and then get your thoughts on renewables versus traditional energy, if that works for you.
Yep, that sounds interesting.
Maybe we'll start at the beginning.
Sure.
To go back to the early days, how did you get into energy and why?
Oh, it's a great question. I had the privilege of graduating from the University of Saskatchewan in the late 80s, and I was electrical, which was a bit unique at the time, especially for energy. And most of my fellow students were heading out to Ontario for Northern Telecom and Bell. But I knew growing up on a farm in Saskatchewan that by far I was a Westerner by heart, and leaving my family, being that far away from the farm, was being out of the West was just something that I didn't really want to do. So coming out to Alberta, at the time in Saskatchewan, there wasn't many jobs when we all graduated. So there was a massive brain drain coming out of Saskatoon. I was like a lemming and followed many of the mechanicals and the chemicals, came into oil and gas because it provided an excellent living and a job at the time in Calgary. So it was an exciting time to move to Calgary in the late 80s with the Olympics, the Flames winning the playoffs in 89. And it was an excellent city to land in.
Did you have an inspiration or a role model at the time? What inspired you? What got you into it?
It's way less inspirational than that. In my first year of engineering, I was so sure that, you look to the left, look to the right, and I would be the one that would be exited. And my first year classes just clicked. I got it. And for some reason, I got okay marks. So I just kept going into electrical engineering. Definitely had an affinity for math and science. Growing up in the farm and pretty much a tomboy on the farm, the curiosity of how things work, how to fix things, how to make it better, which is key phrases of any self-respecting engineer, is always how can you make it a little bit better than what it is already. So engineering was a very logical step for me at the time. And like I said, it clicked with the electrical engineering course load and away I went.
And the word of mouth was that you could get a good job in Calgary at the time.
Well, yes and no. It was tough, to be honest with you, in the 80s. I did all my summer student positions with oil and gas companies in the field, which was by far my preference because you weren't in a city. Out of the university, you got out of being indoors for 8 months. And that's by far where I grew up. It was in the outdoors, in the rural setting.
My grandma grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan in the 30s. Mm-hmm. She's 103 years old now, did a chemistry degree and started work in that field in the 40s. So there's something about the rural upbringing and there's a correlation, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. No, good for her.
You started working in Imperial originally. Mm-hmm. What led to that job and why?
Well, my summer student positions, because all of my summer student positions were it was called Astro Resources Canada Ltd at the time. It was funny because when I graduated, I was supposed to had the job offer to go into instrumentation and automation. And then Imperial was going through some transformation and they decided to reallocate and they put me into drilling. And I can remember talking to my mom and dad about it, and my dad saying, well, just give it a try. Just give it a go and see how it goes. Because I thought, I'm going to lose all of my electrical skills. And what do I know about drilling? And, they kind of had not the best open, welcoming culture for females at the time. But as it turned out, I absolutely loved it. And I really enjoyed the field work. Saw all sorts of parts of Northern Alberta, Northern BC, Northwest Territories. I would never have been able to travel to those places right in our own backyard now had I not taken that assignment right out of the gates as an EIT.
So you literally go to the rigs and you were doing well site?
100%. And that was, Imperial had that training program at the time. You had to go where the rubber hits the road, and it is on the rig floor. And so, traveling to remote areas, staying in drill camps, driving, this was before cell phones, even XJs. And when I think about it now and sending, my kids out there, you'd wonder what the heck you're in for. But the sites and the people that I met, just the curiosity that I had to, how were these wells drilled? What's everybody's role on the rig? And really spending the time to understand their job, being present when things were going right, and being present on the rig floor when things were going wrong. And that's really where I learned. But it completely satisfied my curiosity. How do we drill and find oil and gas? And we were doing a ton of exploration at the time, so not everything was successful. Not everything was economic. But again, I was so lucky to be able to cut my teeth in that type of environment.
So you would have been early 20s at the time, going out into the field with...
Yeah, 21. Yeah.
What was that like? Were you intimidated?
It's funny enough. I never had, I can honestly look you in the eye, I never had any issues, whether I was staying in camp or staying in one end of the well site shack. I think sometimes it's, but luck of the draw for sure by the people that you get to work with and how welcoming they are to helping you learn and coming up that learning curve. But also I had just such a thirst to trying to figure out how it all came together and how does that crew work together in sync? How do we, the safety processes, the technical processes, the tools, the service companies, how they come and go. And I can honestly tell you, it really wasn't until I got into the executive ranks that's when I noticed all of the issues about being a female in the oil and gas industry. When I was in the field, you were a set of hands, you were a helper, you were a support to the well site supervisor or the folks on the rig, just like you are in the farm. And I can honestly tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed that time and was very fortunate that I was welcomed and that they spent the time with me answering all of my, I'm sure, incredibly dumb questions so that I could really understand from A to B, how to drill a well, how to complete a well, how to test a well, how to evaluate a well. I was privileged to have that opportunity, as it served me well when I eventually went into mergers and acquisitions and you're trying to understand production and operations. It was a skill that I relied on a lot.
What were your parents thinking at the time?
Good question. I can't imagine what my mom and dad were thinking. Probably what they don't know doesn't hurt them about drill camps. And, definitely was by far in lots of those, 2-week or 3-week drills, by far the only female on the crew, but you never felt that way. But you got to remember growing up in a farm in Saskatchewan, especially we had both a grain and cattle farm. And my job was probably more outside and more with the cattle than it was with the grain. My brothers looked after the grain a bit more, and you were a set of hands. And you weren't viewed by gender. It was, okay, we all had a job to do and we're all here to get this done. And we all want to get home from whatever northern camp we're at. Let's put everybody together as a team and figure this out and get the job done. And that was a lot of how I was raised on the farm as well.
In your early 20s, a lot of times you don't really know where things are headed in your career. But at the time, what were you thinking? You just need to get as much experience as you can?
Completely. I definitely in my 20s, I had a tough time adjusting to living full time in the city. So I honestly thought I would be field based, say a week on, week off, or 2 weeks on, whatever the hitch was at the time, that I would be in operations. I would be in field, have some aspect of field work, because when I got out of the city and I got to the rural areas, it was It's just so refreshing. You could breathe again. And at the time, it was a perfect adjustment coming out of Saskatchewan, for me anyway, versus just completely working in Calgary head office in the high-rise kind of office building. So I actually thought that's how my career would go. And I honestly never thought otherwise.
So we'll probably skip a few steps or miss a few things here, but through your 20s, you started Imperial and you kept going through the field. So what did you do next?
So got amazing training with Imperial. And then some of the Imperial engineers, when we took over Texaco Canada, went on to AEC, Alberta Energy Company, which they just come from a Crown Corp to a publicly traded company. And eventually got asked from other engineers that I work with to please come and work with them again in different companies. So then moved on from Imperial. Imperial, like I said, was slowing down with that merger. The merger was a tough one. The mixture of the cultures was very difficult. We used to call it downsizing in the early 90s. Everybody was being downsized. And so I still remember this. I went in and I actually asked my boss for a package because I saw all these people being packaged. They had families and I had nobody. I had student loans, but no mortgage, no obligations. I thought, oh, give me a package. I'll go back to school or I'll do something. And no, we're not going to give you a package. And then lucky enough, 6 months after that, I did get a package, paid off my student loans, and then went to work with other engineers that had previously left Imperial. And so got very fortunate because of the network and the trust and the relationship that I built with those engineers, and went to work at AEC. That was one example. And Upton Resources was exactly the same as well. Worked with a Imperial engineer that was the VP of engineering for Upton. And he asked me to come over when it was time to come from a large company to a startup.
So Calgary in the 70s and 80s for female was a different place than it is now. At the time, were you thinking that you have a shot at management? Was that in your thoughts?
Not at all. Not at all. It may sound naive, but that just wasn't even in. It was more learning, enjoying. Where can I contribute? Where can I add value? I wanted to be on challenging plays, challenging projects. And I got that with AEC. And then when I went to Upton, it was more, how do I learn how to run a company? Not necessarily thinking that that's what I would do, but I had so much interest in how does this all work together? And of course, the smaller startups at the time, you got that ability because you got to see it all. You got to do everything. And that's when I really got to roll up my sleeves and do operations, do reserves, do business development, do M&A, you name it. It was just fantastic. So for somebody like me, again, in a startup, the harder that you work, the more experience that you got. And you could do 5 years in a startup and get 10 years of experience, if you will, versus you could work 3 years in a major and get a year and a half of experience. Why would you rest on your laurels? Like, let's go, right? And that's what would appeal to me for sure at the time with the startup, is I was able to see it all and be able to be a part of it all.
So you roughly went from Imperial to AEC, and then this would have been mid to late 20s. So then I think you had a couple different jobs. What was your next major role?
So during Upton and then after was really when I have 3 children, and talk about learning and chaos and the most wonderful time in my career. And so for the last little bit at Upton, I was actually working 4 days a week. Before, working 4 days and 1 from home was cool because, well, of course, we didn't have the technology, but the Dutton family and Upton, they were just so family-centric companies. That definitely was one of them. So then when I had my son, my last, I was working part-time for a US-based company, and that's when their business model was developing and then selling, developing just enough to maximize some value and then sell. And that's really when I was so intrigued about the strategy of asset sales, how to maximize value for obviously your shareholders. So segued into that, still very much operational focused, very much production, drilling, completions, but was really able to contribute in a meaningful way into the strategy that you go into developing a brand new area and then for ultimate exit and asset sale.
So that takes you to early 30s, more or less.
Yeah, at early to mid. Now you're really making me think now back. But yeah, approximately that. Yeah.
When did you end up at ARC Resources?
That was after Birchcliff. So when we sold our one of our last key assets at Coke, then again, through people that I knew, actually stemming back to Imperial, funny enough, was asked to come over to Birchcliff. So did that, and was right after we had purchased the Devon assets for the Peace River Arch, and was able to work with a couple of amazing geologists to develop the Montney and to kick that play off, and obviously that company off as well with Birchcliff. So worked for many years, eight or 9 years as VP Ops, VP Engineering for Birchcliff. And then Birchcliff was very focused in Alberta. I got very intrigued about what was going on in British Columbia. It was deeper, it was higher pressure, potentially way more layers to exploit. Myron Stadnick had gone to U of S as well and had met Myron over the years, of course. And I was very honored to go to work for Myron as VP Operations at the time and build out the operational team. Really set the stage for some Montney development, because ARC had drilled by far the first Montney horizontal in Dawson in 2005. And had continued to drill Dawson, Sunrise, and some of their key strike areas. When I came over, that's when Tower, which was an oil play in the Montney, and we were exploiting deeper into the lower Montneys and different plays as well. So got to experience harder drilling, harder fracking, longer horizontals, and much different technology as we watched technology evolve during that time.
So for the listener, it's 2005.
Yeah.
You've just drilled.
Well, ARC did. I wasn't there at the time, but ARC drilled in 2005, the first Dawson Montney well. I was at Birchcliff at the time, and let me tell you, we watched that very closely. And whatever public information we could pull from that, we did. And, how do we bring that technology across the border into Alberta and exploit the Montney that we just bought from Devon?
Right. So you knew the potential was there? Or what were you thinking at the time? Because
I got to give the geos the credit. From a drilling point of view, we knew the Montney had gas, because as we were drilling deep basin, you drilled through 300 meters of the Montney, and it was a pain drilling it. It was hard digging. We'd scrub bits. We'd curse. It would slow down our drill pace. But I would say between, Miles Bosman and Don, the other senior geologist at Birchcliff, by far, they knew the potential of the Montney. What we had to do is find an affordable economic technology to develop it. And that's when the team really got to work. And that was just such an exciting time to be part of. But to take what ARC had done and, how do we cut costs? How do we make it better? How do we make it fit for purpose in the Poos trend of the Montney?
do you remember that well? Do you remember the coordinates of that first Montney well?
Oh, no, I don't. I mean, if I looked on a map, I could absolutely find it. But we tested, there was a company called Packers Plus at the time, and Halliburton was out with the sand plug technology at the time. Us engineers, because we had so many trials and tribulations with that technology, we used to call it the plug and pray, because you still weren't really sure that you were getting isolated fracs along your horizontal length of your wellbore. So therefore you weren't getting the contribution that you thought you should have. So when Packers Plus, coming out of Southeast Sask, had developed their Packers enough to hold the differential, then we tested it on a vertical well. And I remember that extremely clearly, being part of the team, because we were testing just, can we hold these Packers vertically? And then we went horizontal with it on a different well, and risky at the time. But, if you think about it, what did we have to lose? We were startup. We knew the resource potential was there, but how do we get it out economically at the gas prices of the day? And of course, we'd been scratching around in the Triassic looking for half a BCF wells, thinking we had really done something good. And then all of a sudden, these Montney horizontals hits that now they're 10 to 12 BCF, if not more, of reserve potential. So it was a fantastic time to be an operational engineer. It was a fantastic time to be an engineer in that industry during that time, because we were doing so many unique technological advances to get the reserves, to build these companies, to build our reserve base that Canada can now enjoy. And if you think back, it was amazing some of the things that the folks in the field did for us, the service partners that we had, our service companies, the technology that was developed and how we pushed them and how they pushed us. It was a great time.
In simple terms, the Montney Formation is a deep formation of rock that is hard to access. And in the old days, you couldn't get economic hydrocarbons from it because it was so deep and the porosity was tight. But then you started to realize there was lots of gas there.
Yeah.
But how did you know the resource was there at the time before you started to?
Well, I'm going to steal the words out of Gio's mouth, but when we were drilling through verticals, you would see some gas shows. And in areas where there was some fractures in the Montney, you would see, you'd say you take a gas kick, but there wasn't really a lot of volume behind it, but you did see it. So you knew the gas was there. Through many cores, many different analysis, even though the Montney really is a siltstone at heart, it has the thickness of it. And the permeability was tight, but the porosity was there. We would target certain layers within the Montney. Of course, we went to the tier 1 layers first, as every self-respecting startup does, to try to maximize your potential and your wellbore and your well results. And then we would refine the technology and keep going. We would go deeper. We would go longer. We would play with the interwell spacing to a point to where we probably pushed it too close together and it became a little bit uneconomic, and then we had to distance it again. So I don't think we've cracked the nut yet on the Montney. I'll be honest with you, Trev. Like, I think the latest and greatest and the companies that are pushing that envelope, looking at their well results and their reserve bookings and the liquids that are coming with it, their footprints, so the well pad design, the companies have taken it to a whole nother level again.
The reserves keep getting rewritten up.
Exactly. And good plays get better. Good pools get better. Good plays continue to get better. And that is by far the Montney's the poster child for that.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Connate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Connate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@connatewater.com or check out connatewater.com for more details. This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's trusted leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance, pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. JSG proudly supports Canada's energy infrastructure with competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources. Visit jsginc.com for more information. Sometimes the deep wells can be expensive at the time. Was there a tension on managing costs and finding the hydrocarbons? How did you think about the risk?
Some of our early capital costs for the results that we got, of course. But at the time, that's how you advance technologies, right? That it takes a couple key players, like when ARC drilled the first Dawson well, when companies like Birchcliff took it to another level as well. And then, of course, there's been many, many more. Sometimes you do have to take that risk. But then that's when the engineers have to get to work. That's when we earn our keep by how do we get the costs down? How do we make it more efficient? From a drilling point of view, the drill times now are amazing compared to 25 days it would used to take for us from spud to rig release to drill one of these wells. They're sub 7 days easily. Rotary steerable technology came up from the States, and that's been a step change in our directional drilling performances as well. Our muds, the different muds that we've played with over the years has added value. So once we knew what these wells could be potentially capable of, then we had to go to work and work with our service partners and the contractors and figure it out so that it was economic at extremely low gas prices, because we kind of did it to ourselves because we brought on all this supply, and then of course not the gas prices tanked, as they always do when supply exceeds demand. So luckily we've been resilient enough that we probably have the lowest F&D in North America.
Yeah. So, but for example, how much did one of those wells cost?
The first couple wells would, if my memory serves me right, I think ARC's well was like 9 million, or like it was off the charts compared to, a drill cost now of 1.5 in some cases. Depends on how shallow you are and of course, what layer you're drilling. But now when you see $2 or $3 million, now, of course, just the D&C component, the drilling and completions component, that the companies are posting amazing capital efficiencies for the productivity that they're getting.
But $9 million is a lot of money to
in the day
risk.
Yeah. Yeah. And luckily, ARC had certainly deeper pockets than some of the startups. The investor sentiment, I would, not to forget the shareholders and the folks that are behind some of the startups at the time, because we were searching around in tiny little pools, and our chance of success of drilling a Cascapno well or a halfway well, it certainly wasn't a sure thing. So the investors were speaking to us already that, hey, we don't really like the exploration risk. We don't really like exploration. When we segued into unconventional gas and the development of the Montney, it wasn't that you were going to get a dry well. I guess maybe that's possible in some portions of it, but it was more, we were starting to develop the type curves and the type curves for the Montney. And, what position on that type curve were you going to sit? And then how much do you frack? How much sand do you use to get those reserves, to get that productivity out for the wells? So that's when we really got investor sentiment back in, because we stopped doing 1 in 10 Cascapno vertical wells and we went straight into the Montney, where the risk is lower. And we committed to driving those capital costs down with partnership with some of our contractors. You can't do it without folks like Precision Drilling and the technology that they put on their rigs. I mentioned Packers Plus, but now the pump down plugs and the downhole tools, it's amazing what these service companies have provided for us for technology and the partnership that we've worked with them to keep driving that down. The fracking companies, getting the efficiency to pump as many fracks and as much sand in a 24-hour period as you can. The water, the supply of the water to make sure that there's no pausing in your fracture operations. It is a well-oiled machine now.
And one of the other benefits is liquids contents in some of those wells, which are, for the listener, is a very high valued product that is associated with natural gas, for instance, propane and butane.
Yep, butane.
Did you encounter that?
100%. And, the economics of putting, when you're processing the gas, and the Montney gas always came out, what we say, hot. So it was rich with liquids. Then really, when we got more egress for our liquids, especially off the West Coast now, with AltaGas and Pembina, instead of just sending all of the liquids down to the United States, that's when the value of those NGLs really took off. So putting deep cut on a gas plant, whether it's in BC or Alberta, the economics definitely were there. Obviously, CAPS and Pembina have developed pipelines into Fort Sask and extra frac capacity for those liquids. So that just added another revenue stream. As we started to develop deeper in the Montney, that's typically where we saw the hotter of the gas come out and the liquids content come out. And in some cases, like the strike area of Tower, it was definitely an oil. When I was working at Seven Generations, the Kakwa strike area, liquids, we were the largest condensate producer in Canada. And that field was very much liquids rich and very much full of hot gas. So we enjoyed those revenue streams when, gas was under $1.
Mm-hmm. Did you view it as a gas opportunity, or did you view it as a liquids opportunity?
That changed with the market. When gas was up, we viewed it as a gas opportunity. When gas was low, and that seems to be more often than not, it feels like you are drilling those richer areas of your Montney land position. So you have to be that nimble and that diverse with your drilling inventory as well.
You understood the magnitude of the resource at the time, but did you realize how much more was there, or did you think of the potential?
We knew the recovery factors early on were still high. There's still, people might sit back to the non-oil and gas, technical person. You might still say, well, there's that much left in the zone and you guys walked away, even conventional oil and gas. So at the time, did we think we knew it all and we could develop it so you get way lower than sub 50% recovery factors? No. We were on the hunt for productivity, for higher capital efficiency, more cash flow. Ultimately that drove us, was our primary driver. But then as you got into it, and each time you drilled a well, okay, how do we get better next time? What can we do better? What can we tweak? When you work with teams of operational engineers that want to do better, that are curious, they want to figure it out. They want to cut costs, or they want to increase productivity and reserve, whichever way you're looking at it, or liquids content. It can be a lot of fun. But then you discover, right, that things can get better. And I still don't think we've completely exhausted everything that the Montney or the Duvernay can give us right now. There's way more potential there, and it's an exciting time.
Do you think is it a matter of technology catching up to the resource, or is it the fact that there's just so much there we haven't captured it, even with today's technology?
Yeah. Necessity at the time was the mother of invention. When we were, 2008, if you think back, the financial crisis, and we were singing for our suppers there, you had to dig. You had to find cash flow. A lot of as companies, were carrying a fair amount of debt at the time, and our balance sheets weren't nearly as healthy as they are today. You'd be amazed at the work that you can do when okay, the next well's got to be better. We got to figure this out. We got to bring it home. And the work and the diligence that you put into that with your service company partners, because they've got skin in the game too. Because if they can make it work, there's a whole fairway that they can go to work with in both Alberta and BC. So yeah, you don't know what you don't know. But just like, we had such great culture of within the teams, within the companies, of trying to be successful, of growing that company, because growth was being rewarded back then. And that drove us beyond, that was our inspiration, I guess, at the time.
It seems like a small number of people that recognize the opportunity of the Deep Basin at the time. But why do you think companies like ARC, among others, Tourmaline, were the ones that actually captured it? What made them different? Birchcliff, why were they able to get ahead of things, and what did they do differently than everybody else?
I think it starts when I think of all three of those companies, the culture at the top of the technology, and having key geoscientists, key engineers in their executive ranks that were at the time, they don't have to necessarily be the CEO, but definitely a part of the senior leadership team, driving for that technology, leading the company into those plays and being committed to those plays despite high costs or low natural gas prices, to be able to have the vision to see what it could do for those companies, what it could do for our provinces, our royalties, our country, you name it. I think that is so key, to have been in the privilege of working with folks like that. Because there was a lot of doubting Thomases to begin with. Why are you spending so much money working in unconventional? And not at all to downplay the role of conventional oil and gas along this whole journey. Even today, they play a very important role. Southeast Saskatchewan plays a very important role. That's where we cut our teeth on horizontal well drilling. And then we brought that over into into Alberta, but that's where it started. But having those key leaders at the top pushing us and allowing us the ability to innovate, to figure it out. Obviously, a bit of the opportunity with the land position that we had, both vertically as well as regionally in BC and Alberta. I think that was key. But there was a lot of opposition to begin with. There was a lot of companies that would state there that they're not going into the Montney. And that's okay. They were successful. They found their place and away they went too. But I was very fortunate to be able to go where most of the capital went. And that's what engineers want to do, right? Is we want to build, we want to create, we want to grow, we want to tweak, we want to invent. And it was very amazing time to be an engineer.
It's hard to be kind of a bootstrapped entrepreneur in that part of the oil and gas industry, but did you ever think about starting your own company?
No. I feel like I know myself now. It's easy to say now that I'm a little bit older. I've never thought, okay, that's exactly what I wanted to do, was to be a CEO and start my own or run my own. I think my technical background and my view on strategy and how you merge the two and you set up a strategic plan and then how do you execute it, whether it's M&A, whether it's greenfield development in a new Montney fairway or a new layer of the lower Montney. That's where I really, really found enjoyment and challenge and felt that's where I could add the most value. So for me, being a supporting actor, I've been so lucky in my career and totally exceeded anything that I ever thought that I'd ever be able to be a part of in Calgary.
Not to give away your secrets, but do you think there's some uncovered zones within the Montney or different formations altogether that you've stumbled upon through the years?
Oh, they keep pushing the limits. I think in the Montney, there are definitely some layers that we need to have another look at when technology and economics allow us to. And sometimes you stumble upon them with serendipity when you're drilling or something goes wrong and the well path, goes a little deeper than what you want or you name it. But there's a lot of still potential that we can find in the Montney, and how, again, it also goes back to how do we continue to optimize that recovery factor to squeeze the most out of the existing Montney wells that we do have and the layers that we do have. But when you look at our inventories, I don't think anybody calls us inventory light in BC or Alberta. In fact, we have got way more inventory than what the US does right now. We'll see what that buys us over time. But inventory isn't our issue. It's more the egress, getting the best price for our resource. And I think that's the challenge right now, is more on the marketing side.
And making money.
And making money and keeping that profitability. But, during COVID, even when I was on the board at Crew Energy, we all buttoned down the hatches and really worked hard to improve our balance sheets, worked hard at maximizing free cash flow. And our companies came out of COVID stronger than they've ever been. And our balance sheets are in great shape, especially as we enter, this period of potential even more tariffs and trade relations, maybe not in the best situation that we'd hoped with the US. But I do think our producers are in great shape to weather the storm. And we just need a little bit more government support to help get us some access to different markets.
If you were to compare the potential of the Montney to a baseball game, what inning do you think we're in?
I still say fifth, that we still have a stretch, if you will, to go. And we're not done yet. Technology continues on the drilling side even. I shouldn't say even, because they've made wonderful strides right on the drill floor to improve efficiency in production, in compression, getting that tail on some of these older Montney wells and making sure that we extract all the reserves possible. Some of the lift and the compression and what we can do to extract that last 100, 200 MCF of gas out of that well. There's a lot of research going into that from a production point of view. So there's still a lot of learning to do to help out these areas we have.
Do you think it'll be a 9-day difference politically if things change federally, kind of like what's happening in the States, and that it'll really speed up development in Canada? Or is eventually the resources there anyways, it'll just happen?
No, it's funny. If you would have asked me that question, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, and especially now with working more in the APAC area of the world, where they would say to me, well, we'd love to get LNG, but First Nations is really impeding your ability to export LNG off the West Coast. Now it's our own government that's impeding our ability. The First Nations are on side. In fact, we're looking at we've demonstrated that we want them to be our partners. We can participate with First Nations as an equity owner in these projects. It's our own government that's standing in the way. So one can only hope that with a change in federal government or with the current geopolitical situation that we have ongoing with the U.S., that now is the time. I'm super excited about discussion about knocking back some of the bureaucracy, the regulation, providing an energy corridor. And there's many different things to that energy corridor that we need, that we can participate in. So I'm very hopeful that we see much more favorable energy policy come out of our federal government. I would say our climate policy probably is going to be paused, if not much different than what it has been in the last 8 years. But if we don't have a favorable federal energy policy, we're going to be landlocked again.
Mm-hmm. Your experiences at ARC and the Montney was kind of what led you to 7 Generations, which is where I think you went next.
Yeah, when I left ARC, I actually went and worked for a time in the electricity market with ATCO. Got recruited to help them come off coal with their coal generation units. And it was a complete 90-degree shift from operations, from engineering and oil and gas, a segue into the electricity market. And at first I wasn't all that interested in the role. And I thought, no, I'm not going to, really interview. My heart is in oil and gas. This is what I do. And then I got thinking, well, hold on. Maybe if you understand what's going on with electricity market, the generation side of our own local domestic demand for our product, how do you marry the two? Because at the time, Trevor, if you were in oil and gas, you were here, you were on one side. If you were in generation or utilities, you were a totally different side of the energy industry. And we didn't have a lot of crossover. And curiosity killed this cat. And I thought, okay, I want to go over and learn about generation, but more importantly, learn about the energy only market in Alberta and how does electricity settle? How do we spur demand? Because at the time we thought, that would be a perfect demand source for some of our natural gas was the power burn side. So went over there for a couple of years, assisted in getting off coal and then ultimately selling their thermal generation, their coal units, as well as some of their gas to a private equity firm out of Connecticut. And that's when I left because there really was not a lot of generation left in the ATCO portfolio. And then was right away recruited to work as Chief Development Officer with 7 Generations to help build out the Kakwa.
So you spent some time back in the Deep Basin drilling wells again, but then ultimately you ended up back at ARC, or 7 Gen sold to ARC? Or...
Yeah, 7 Gen. Yeah, so when I went to 7 Generations, it was just before COVID, and then we went through COVID, and we did for about a year, we looked at that merger and that acquisition, or we called it a merger of equals, but really it was a sale of 7 Gens to ARC Resources. It was a really unique time to be doing an $8 billion deal in your home office hidden, which actually worked out very well from a confidentiality point of view. But after the first year of seeing the asset that 7 Gens had and were exploiting, the liquids potential it had, the pressure and the depth and the type of wells that we were drilling. But at the time, that's what 7G was Kakwa. At the same time, obviously, my relationships were still very current with ARC, knew what was going on. They had sold some of their Pembina assets and were really looking at upping their liquids content again. They had lower decline, lower debt. We had higher decline, a little higher debt. So for a long time, we modeled the two companies together as the poster child for 7. That's what we wanted to aspire to, not thinking that we would ever merge with ARC. Because at the time, ARC really wasn't an acquirer. Wasn't, not like a Tourmaline or a CNRL. They were very much greenfield, very organic based. And then ARC went under some changes, and lo and behold, the two chairmen started to chat, and things started to get real. And definitely a very interesting time to combine the two companies. But the synergies and what we needed and what they needed, that has got to be one of the most logical mergers I've ever been involved with, because especially if you put your shareholder hat on, it was absolutely in the best interest of the shareholder to bring those two companies together.
And the idea is when you scale up economies of scale, you can access the resource better with more money in a bigger company.
100%. Even if you think about stocks and how they trade, the liquidity and being a bigger market cap, which we really wanted to do with 7G, that just bumped us right up. Investment grade. There's so many pluses about that merger that happened as a result of bringing those two companies together. Capital allocation. So if you need more liquids, you drill Kakwa. If you need more gas, you go to BC. So if you think of that, the executive now, they've got a portfolio of Montney of excellent resource to pick from for their capital allocation.
In the depressed valuations and the underfavored equity markets for oil and gas, there hasn't been enough retail shareholders to go around for all the energy companies. If you look back on things, do you think that was the right move to consolidate and create one bigger company for shareholders?
Yes. And the reason that I say that is when you look at the multiples of where you were trading, the bigger the company, the different indexes that you got into, the institutions that can now had minimum thresholds of where they could invest and the liquidity that they needed to invest. Again, putting my shareholder hat on, 100% your multiples are way bigger. When you're larger, you've attracted those types of shareholders. So if you do have the need to raise equity or, of course, everybody wants accretion, nobody wants dilution, you command those types of multiples. So, and if you don't have that as a potential option, if you do need to raise equity at an accretive value, it is pretty tough. If the use of those proceeds, do present themselves that you do need to raise equity, obviously, and boards consider that very seriously and, look at a bunch of different avenues before they go down that road. But it's sure nice to know that you're commanding a high multiple in the case that were to present itself.
This episode is brought to you by Astro Oilfield Rentals. Planning your next drilling or completion site? Astro has your remote communications and accommodations needs covered. With over 25 years of experience serving Western Canada, Astro continues to expand, innovate, and deliver the best value for your investment. Astro offers a full range of communication solutions, including cell towers, radios, and internet services. Astro's lineup features well site trailers, sleepers, full gym units, medic centers, and custom-built command centers, helping you stay connected and comfortable in even the most remote locations. Visit astrorentals.ca for virtual tours and more information. This episode is brought to you by the Global Energy Show Canada. With new federal leadership and increasing global pressure, Global Energy Show Canada comes at a defining moment for the energy sector. Happening June 10th to 12th in Calgary, this year's event features 5 halls of exhibition, 2 world-class conferences, and a powerful theme titled Canada's Energy Mandate through 2030. Peter Mansbridge, one of Canada's most respected voices, will lead conversations with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and executives from Cenovus, Shell, Petronas, and more, driving discussions on investment, Indigenous-led projects, and energy exports. Global Energy Show Canada is where the future of Canadian energy takes shape. Register now at globalenergyshow.com/register. If 7Gen had continued on the path it was on, prices covered and a lot of great inventory, so the company would have been okay probably, but in this case, it was just better for everybody.
100%. There was nothing wrong with the resource inventory of 7Gens whatsoever. But I would say I go back to that capital allocation of being able to drill a little bit of Kakwa and a little bit in BC and just having that opportunity to put your capital where the most economics kind of point it towards. Their capital budgets are much more optimized, I think, when you've got some diversity in your portfolio.
And then you went to ATCO, I think?
Yeah, I actually took some time off and I thought, okay, maybe it's time to go out to pasture now to refer back to my farming days. And then then a friend from ATCO called and said, hey, we're developing we're trying to purchase a couple of small solar assets. And, would you come over and work with the non-reg, the clean energy, now called EnPower, but clean energy company on behalf of ATCO? And I thought, oh, yeah, what could go wrong, right? Like 2 solar assets. Sure, this could be interesting, could be fun. And then 6 months later, my partner and I found ourselves on the way to Sydney, Australia to build out the Sydney office and build up some project inventory there on behalf of ATCO. So things have a you never know what some curveballs present themselves, but we did buy those solar assets. They're in the city of Calgary around Barlow and Deerfoot, and they are developed. They're First Nations partnered, actually. We have the Stoney as our partner on those 2 solar assets. And once that deal was well underway is when we decided to take an expat assignment to Australia.
So you moved to Australia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we lived in Sydney, Australia for 2 years. Yeah.
So you got an understanding of the renewables side of the business. For the listener, that was the sector you were working in at the time?
Yeah, renewables as well as hydrogen development. But primarily in Australia. Australia was a big believer at the time of green hydrogen. So your first step in is getting renewables, because you can't have green hydrogen without a renewable electricity, basically a renewable molecule to produce that. So yeah, I went over to Australia and really dove into their electricity market. They have an energy-only electricity market, very similar with some differences to the Alberta market, of course, our energy-only market. We're a little farther ahead for sure in terms of renewables penetration. And you got the luxury of seeing what could go wrong when you see that much renewable penetration, and what it does to grid stability, what it does to pricing, how do they incentivize, where are they looking for base load power. So it was a very intriguing time to be in Sydney and working on some project portfolio on behalf of EnPower.
Now that you have experience on the traditional oil and gas side of the business and the renewable side of the business, the idea is that everybody wants a greener planet, but at times there are conflicts between renewables and traditional energy, one of which is the energy supply and reliability, because you need a reliable power source. At the end of the day, that's pretty much the whole point. Do you think that there's potential for renewables to become reliable, or how far away is it from something we can count on?
Yeah, I go back to my grandma saying everything in moderation. South Australia is a state in Australia, and they are 100% renewables, and they have outages, and they have very much issues on that exact front is reliability. So when I was there, you got to see how that's working for that state, as well as the unrest, the social unrest that comes with that. I think we're quite a ways away of being 100% renewables. You have to remember that, just like any energy, that you have to marry it with the economy. You can't leave economics and the economy and the affordability behind. Yes, you're doing it. As you mentioned, Trev, everybody wants a green planet. Everybody wants clean energy. Of course they do. But at the expense of what? If you go back in the last 3 to 5 years, I think we left certain segments of our society behind. And when you start to see an increase in homeless and people that can't afford homes, or people can't afford their energy bill, is that really what we're striving for? So we're so lucky to have a low cost supply of natural gas that I'm a firm believer that both in moderation. That's tough in an energy-only market. And as worldwide, we're seeing energy-only markets struggle and in some cases blow up. Alberta, when they deregulated, back when Ralph Klein was our premier, we went from a regulated market to an unregulated market, and we implemented a market structure called energy-only market. It is private, it is deregulated, and the generation was owned by private proponents and companies like ATCO, Capital Power, TransAlta, and how we bid and how we supply electricity and how we dispatch. And that's a very key word, is the dispatchable energy, because coal and gas is very dispatchable. If our system operator calls or the market calls for every 30 minutes for supply, we can turn it on, we can dial it down. Renewables, you don't get that. And so that's the challenge, is say in the middle of a July afternoon and your solar farm, which is, let's say it's 400 megawatts of solar, and all of a sudden a hailstorm comes in and the clouds cover up, right away you see that solar farm decrease in terms of its capacity and its supply. So the struggles that a deregulated energy-only market have in keeping system strength and reliability, and in some cases affordability, you're starting to see, just like the Premier Smith is undertaking right now, is some modifications to an energy-only market. And that's exactly what the provinces of Alberta is under right now, is a restructured energy market, and they're redefining the energy-only market in Alberta. And Australia is doing exactly the same as is other jurisdictions when you see the renewable penetration starting to come into the generation mix.
So when you change from an energy-only market to the alternative, what does that mean?
Well, you have to focus on reliability and affordability. Reliability not only from the grid, but reliability that when it gets cold in January in Alberta, we have enough power to supply folks living in all sorts of different areas of our province, not just certain areas of the province. So if you're relying on private industry, you're hoping that the investors come in and they'll invest and they'll build up enough supply. With an energy-only market that's settling at $20 versus $120, that's a pretty tough investment for any private investing or any company to make right now, because your returns just aren't there and there's no certainty. So the government is looking at modifying the rules of the market in Alberta. We've all kind of stepped back and taken a pause until the market, we're more certain of where this market and the market rules will head. Right now, Alberta's in a position of oversupply in terms of generation, and we've recently added quite a bit of gas-fired generation. So currently we're in an oversupply, which is great, because right now amount of renewables under development as well as further gas has been paused until the government works through the REM, or the restructured energy market, and redefines what our energy market's going to look like and how do we buy and sell electricity in this province.
So the idea is that you might shift more towards, say, natural gas produced electricity from both private and public sector providers?
It's an interesting dilemma if you actually look at other jurisdictions, that not all of it can be private, because when you build out capacity and the capacity is sitting there waiting for a cold day in January, but when you're called, you have to produce. Sometimes that's called in different areas a capacity market. That can be problematic for private companies to invest in. So sometimes there's a dual market. Sometimes private company doesn't like it when the government steps in and owns piece of the market, right? Because now they've dabbled in a free market, or what once was a free market. So we're anxiously waiting to see how the restructured energy market settles. And what does that mean for futures? Because right now the power price is at a all-time low in Alberta in terms of just the generation component. When the new market gets underway later this year, where will they settle? What will it look like for future prices? And what does demand look like as well?
When it gets cold in Alberta, which it inevitably does, every year it seems like there's worries about power demand and there's no redundancy. Is that the reason why there has been redundancies, that the grid is unstable due to renewable issues?
It's a great question. I would say yes in the past. That was really before two big gas-fired generation came on in late 24 and 25. So if you rewind to last January, absolutely supply. And I think we all got on our cell phones, the emergency alert, if you remember that. And it was something, because that was, that's not something that I ever remember happening on my cell phone. I think now we're in an oversupply situation with our gas-fired generation. However, you can't rest back on your laurels either, because demand does change. And for sure, in the Januaries and the Februaries, when it's minus 30 or worse, the wind's not blowing and the turbines aren't moving anyway because of it being a rotating machine. The solar farms are not producing. So we need to have that backup baseload in this province. So,
because in the province with an overabundance of natural gas, why we have power shortages when it's cold every single year. But it sounds like that may be working itself out.
Yeah. But Trev, when you say, why do we have renewables? you got to remember that when you're a renewable developer, are you really selling power or are you selling a carbon credit? More times than not, when we were negotiating PPAs to, different customers, they weren't looking for a power hedge. They were absolutely looking for either a renewable energy credit or an offset. It'll be very interesting what happens after the federal election, whether there will be any sort of a large emitter carbon tax or not, because that could change the demand for renewable PPAs. Because I would venture 9 times out of 10, we were sellers of the credit. We weren't sellers of power. Power was, very similar to our Montney discussion. When oil price was up and gas price was very low, the natural gas price was almost like a waste byproduct, like station 2, right? Just get rid of the gas, find a home for it, because we need the liquids to provide revenue protection for our plays. In essence, a wind farm, a solar farm, certain customers are looking for different capacity factors, and then they could kind of do the math on how many credits that they would get and where they would retire those credits and what markets and in what jurisdictions. They weren't necessarily looking for a power hedge. So it was a waste product, again, of the renewable. Not all, but certainly some were viewing it that way. Like I said, the whole renewable industry, we'll wait to see 2 things. What's our federal policy going to be on the carbon, as well as what will the revised energy market look like at the end of the day?
Europe has been an example of a area that tried to move towards greener policies, but is counterintuitively ended up with failed energy policy. You've had experience on both traditional and renewable side of the sector. How do you avoid that scenario? Is it the pragmatic energy policy going forward?
I think they're aware of it. I give them some credit, if you will. What I think was underestimated was the affordability piece. Europe's population is much different than our population. So if when we were so pressured to put net zero targets out there, when it was still legal to do so, and at the time we were scratching our heads, how are we even, okay, if we need to be net zero by 2030 or 2050, we still weren't entirely clear how we were going to get there, but we were under so much duress to have to state that and find that path forward. But as we saw in the last couple of years, we turned away from the affordability and things got out of hand. If anything that the geopolitical and the potential trade war that's going on with the U.S. has done for us is I hope now it's woken up our federal government to say, okay, we have these great resources, whether it's hydro generation in certain provinces, gas reserves in BC and in Alberta. How do we use that for the better of our country and diversify our markets? And again, everything in moderation. We're not going to get off fossil fuel by 2030. It's going to take time, or we're going to leave certain pockets behind because it becomes unaffordable. And I think we reached the brink point with that we pushed it too far. Being able to access and get a better price for some of our resources off the West Coast, for example, Hudson Bay, through this energy corridor, so that again, those royalties and that cash flow comes back in for investment in this country and provides jobs and more affordable energy for the domestic.
What were the electricity prices in Australia? Do you remember for the megawatt hour?
For sure. So I'm going to quote more on the gas side because that's really where the natural gas policy in Australia differed very much with how the Canadian federal government viewed it at the time. So I was in Sydney when the Russia invaded Ukraine and gas prices hit, $40 a GJ because Australia went in. If you go back over their gas policy, they embraced LNG. They embraced providing their natural gas primarily to Asia, but to the world, and developed way more LNG export facilities and ports than obviously we did in Canada. And they participated full on with that. They contracted a lot of their gas reserves into these long-term LNG contracts. So when the reserves started to equalize and come back more in the domestic demand versus supply equalized, they had these long-term contracts to export their natural gas. So their gas ran and it ran hard, and it still is way more, almost 3-4 times more expensive than what we have in Canada. So maybe that pendulum swung a little too far in terms of making sure you don't go all in. And I guess Canada, the pendulum, if you swing it back where we were saying no to any LNG and we wanted to keep all of our gas in the ground, somewhere in the middle would be my opinion is the right mix. A little bit of both. Of course, you can't starve your own domestic country from its resource. It's a royalty. It's owned by the country. But getting the best value from an export point of view versus giving it away when it goes through station 2 at zero, I don't think that does us any benefit by having that resource produced.
How do Canadian electricity prices compare to Australia or Europe or the States?
Yeah. So, ours, especially in Alberta, because every province is different. So the Alberta electricity price was very high if you go back 2 years ago, prior to this extra gas-fired generation and the renewable penetration coming in. We were settling at 120, 130 and different spikes, of course, through different intervals of the day. So it was very high. And if you looked at your electricity bill, generation is a component, and then, of course, the wires is another component. And I'm only talking about the generation side in the wholesale market when I say $120 a megawatt. In Australia, most people, including ourselves, when we lived in Sydney, were on fixed electricity contracts. There's really only 3 or 4 customers, which are the big retailers. They own the generation or they contract the generation and then they sell it to the consumer. So it's a much different energy-only market and how it settles. But for sure, at a time, we had much higher electricity prices than they did in Australia. And of course, that flipped as supply came in. The cure for high electricity prices is high electricity prices. And then renewable penetration came in and this gas-fired generation hit the market. And, now we're settling in, the $20 range. So much depressed prices that you just can't build for and justify any sort of merchant exposure on your power.
But there's opportunity to lower prices even further for Canadians, probably.
I think right now, obviously, there is restructured energy market. That's certainly a goal of the Alberta government. But the other side of it, of course, is your wires, right? And your transmission, your distribution, and where you build that and how you build that out. And there's quite a bit of focus on that side of the regulations as well, in terms of further transmission and interties between provinces, not just between us and the states, and how do we optimize that? So we'll see where that goes. But I would say the generation from a wholesale market is, I'd hazard a bet that that's as low as you're going to see it right now.
Maybe it needs to be a balance between traditional energy and some renewables.
100%.
Long story short.
Absolutely. Like I said, everything in moderation.
Well, that's some thoughts on renewables versus traditional and a bit of your career and whatnot. Maybe to get towards the end, you've had a lot of technical experience through the years. Imperial, Arc Resource, 7Gen. So you've seen a lot of the aspects in the industry. What makes a good technical leader to you from your perspective?
The best that I've worked with was stay hungry, stay humble, be curious. Go where the rubber hits the road, and that's always the field. You're never going to figure it out in the office. Embrace good teamwork, because there's really no one service company or one engineer or one person that have all the solutions. But some of the best things that we tried was obviously a little bit of trial by error, but of just being in that doghouse and thinking through a project or a problem, what could be going wrong? How do we make it better? What can we tweak? But stay curious, stay hungry to always want to get better. Don't think you've arrived, because like we were talking about the Montney, we're not in the 7th inning, we're in the 5th. It's a great time to be an engineer, especially right now.
Your career is still going and you're still working, but if you were to give advice to a 30-year-old Karen Nielsen, what would you tell her?
Very good question. Take a bit more risks. I think when I was raising 3 kids on my own, and at times having the kids and the mortgage and not a lot of money, I probably, didn't take as many chances as I could have in time. So if I had the foresight, say, it'll all work out, the kids will be fine, I think I would have taken a bit more strategic risks with different companies, or career risks, or operational, try different things. That's probably what I would say, that don't sweat it, right? It'll work itself out.
Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me, Trev.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, but...
No, I think that's about it.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca, where more episodes are yet to come. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.